All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this rendition of Dairy Production. We're going to talk about lameness etiology today, and I love talking about lameness. It's my absolute favorite thing to research. I am just such a lameness nerd. My husband says it's because I'm lame, ha ha ha. But it really is, it's a huge problem in the dairy industry. It's our #1 animal welfare issue. It's really costly to producers as well. And we used to think of it as a problem in confined systems, but it's not just a problem in confined systems anymore. We're also seeing a lot of lame cows out in pasture-based systems and dry lots and things like that. So it's a big problem through the dairy industry and is my personal favorite thing to talk about. And so today we're going to cover why we care about it, talk a little bit about the hoof structure, do a little bit of a biological review, and then talk about some different common lesions and how we can prevent those lesions. So let's talk about why we care. Hoping it'll work. I want you to watch this video and look at what a sound cow looks like. So that means a healthy cow.
This cow has lameness.
So you can see what a sound cow should look like. So sound being a healthy cow. Something that's really difficult in the dairy industry is that lame cows become the norm. And so a lot of times in the dairy industry, if we're looking at lame cows, we might see that a lame cow is actually the norm. So I'm glad that you all could see what a sound cow looks like. And now we're going to see what a lameness cow looks like.
This cow has a lameness score of 1. She's showing some of the early signs of lameness. It's hard to identify a change in walking speed as she will still keep up with the herd. Her strides may be shortened with the rear foot missing the front foot placement. Her steps might be uneven, but close or repeated inspection is required to decide which leg is affected. Her back may be slightly arched and her head lowered while walking if her back foot is lame. Her feet are likely to benefit from examination and further observation is recommended. This cow has a score of 2 and is moderately lame. She's laying on her back right leg. She's walking slower than normal and may stop on the floorboards. Her walking rhythm is irregular and she has a definite shortened stride where her rear foot placement falls short of front foot placement. She has uneven weight bearing and the leg has an
So I'm glad that you all could see what lame cows look like, and you could see going from the sound cow and then as they progressively got worse. So lameness, the definition is an abnormal gait resulting from efforts to minimize pain. And when we're talking about lameness, there are two different camps, that it's either a disease or it's a disorder. I am in the camp that it is a disorder, because it's not, lameness it's resulting from whatever the cow has. So if they have, a hairy heel wart or a sole ulcer, it's going to cause them to walk differently, and that's what we call lameness. Lameness to me is not a disease, because it's not the specific, lameness it's something that specifically is causing them to be lame. So like that digital dermatitis or the sole ulcers, that is what is causing those cows to be lame. So I'm in the camp that it is a disorder, but you will see people that will call it a disease, and that's okay too. So lameness is just an abnormal gait resulting from efforts to minimize pain. One thing that's really difficult with lameness is that it results from multifactorial conditions. So it's not just one condition that affects lameness. It's not just we have a nutrition problem and if we do, we can fix lameness. No, it's problems from the environment, genetics, management. There's different diseases. There's infectious diseases versus non-infectious diseases. And then yes, nutrition can certainly play into it. So it's really difficult when it's multifactorial etiology. It's just a really difficult disease. Prevalence is pretty high. This data is actually from 2007. I will say it has gone down a little bit since then. This is from what we call NAHMS data, National Animal Health Monitoring System. Every 7 years, they monitor 20 states, a bunch of different farms, and collect a bunch of data. And they always collect lameness data. And so you can see on these medium-sized farms that 31% of the cows on a farm are lame. And that is really, really high. If we look at what Temple Grandin says, she says that we should have less than 5% cows lame. I think we can get there, but there's some other skeptics in the dairy industry that say, no, we can't get there. So lameness prevalence is really high. And it's also really expensive. So this is a paper from the Journal of Dairy Science. This is actually one of my friends, Dee Liang. She is a dairy economist. And so she's looked at the cost of different diseases. And so when we look at lameness costs for permiparous cows, she's saying about $185 per case, and multiparous cows, $333 per case. So really high, considering that cows can be lame multiple times throughout a specific lactation. And you can see here that with both permiparous and multiparous cows, that veterinary and treatment costs are the highest cost when we're talking about lameness. And then it kind of varies there between permiparous and multiparous, with multiparous having that extended days open and culling and decreased milk production, where for permiparous it's decreased milk production and culling are really the high. When we're talking about different lesions, they vary by different lesions. So I'm going to talk about sole ulcers and digital dermatitis and foot rot in a moment, in case some of you might not know what those are. But sole ulcer is a very, very painful disease, and that is the highest cost per lesion. So sole ulcer, then digital dermatitis, which is pretty prevalent throughout the industry, and then foot rot. Foot rot, for any of you beef guys out there, you probably have heard of foot rot before. Look at the hoof structure, obviously a drawing. So there's two claws, the medial claw and the lateral claw. On the outside of the claw will be the wall, and then on the very bottom of the claw is the sole. So that's like kind of what actually is on the ground. And then where those two meet is what we call the white line. the white line is the junction between the wall and the sole, and it is the most fragile part of the hoof. We get a disease called white line disease because this is so fragile that if a cow steps on a stone, that's usually where it will puncture through the cow's hoof. So white line is the junction between the sole and the wall, and it's the most fragile point of the hoof. After that, we have the abaxial wall, so that's the outer wall, and then the axial wall is the inside wall. In between the cow's hooves is what we call the interdigital claw. And then the bulb of the heel. The heel is really what keeps the cow's hoof up off of manure. So if any of you have ever judged, you might have said she has a really deep heel. And that is when she has a heel that can keep the rest of the hoof out of manure. And then we just have our accessory digit or our dew claw. We don't actually really know why in cows we have our dew claws. It's probably left over from some evolutionary structure, but we still have our accessory digit or our dew claw. I want you to look at the bottom of this cow's hoof. Here is our fat pad. This is really, really important to cows. And they've actually found that cows that have a lower body condition score have a lower fat pad here. And that can lead to lameness because that can be really hard on cows when they don't have fat. Think about your hoof. Obviously you don't have a hoof. Think about your foot, and where your heel strikes when you're walking, there's a fat pad under that. And so when people are starving, like if they're in a third world country, that is the last piece of fat to be mobilized on their body because that fat pad is so important. And if people have been in like an accident, like if they get their bottom half of their foot cut off, like lawnmowers, that happens quite often with lawnmowers, that fat can never be regenerated. And it's really hard for people to walk because all that's hitting the bottom of the ground now is just a bone. And so this cushion is really important. And you can see that here. This is a really great drawing of what that cushion looks like. And this is a pretty big area of research of people is what happens when this is not there. Are the cows more lame, and when are they mobilizing this? So it's really, really important to have foot pad. Now let's look at some of the biology of the hoof. So when we're looking at the biology of the cow, this has been a slice through of the hoof structure. And so you can see the wall and the sole there, and then that you can see that junction where that white line is, and see how different it is. Obviously it's called the white line because it's white. See how different that is compared to the wall and the sole. So when we're looking at the horn capsule, it's joined by underlying connective tissues, and those are both epidermal and dermal folds of tissues. And when we're looking at the walls, those folds are regularly arranged, and you can see those in the laminae. And then the sole, those folds are irregularly arranged, and those have papillae on them as well. So when we also look at around the entire hoof, there is a corium there, or if you've ever worked with dogs, you would call that the quick. And that's going to be important when we're talking about a specific disease later on. So remember that the corium really is kind of surrounding the entire hoof so that you all can see that hoof. And so the very, very first lesion that I want to talk about is laminitis. And that is inflammation of the laminae, or in this case, we call it the corium. And you can see on the left is the normal corium, and on the right is the damaged corium. And so right now, Sorry, I have to take a drink. So right now, the way that we think of laminitis, oh, sorry, people are talking in the background. All right, so the way that we think that we have laminitis is that when a cow gets acidosis, bacteria are going to die. And when bacteria in the gut die, or when a bacteria die anywhere, they release endotoxins, and so those endotoxins get picked up the bloodstream, and then those go into really vascular areas like the hoof where the corium is, and that's what causes laminitis. There's lots of different debates out there going on, but that is kind of the consensus at the moment. So when we're talking about common lesions, we need to break them down into non-infectious and infectious. Just like when we were talking about mastitis and we talked about environmental or contagious, those are two very different types of mastitis, treated and prevented very differently. And that's the same thing with lameness. We need to talk about non-infectious and infectious diseases. So non-infectious diseases are sole hemorrhage, sole ulcers, and white line diseases. So sole hemorrhage is just a discoloration of the sole. It's when blood has been incorporated into the horn tissue, and this usually happens right before we get a sole ulcer or a white line disease. So it is a lesion in itself, but it's usually predisposition for a more severe lesion. So the pathogenesis is that it really occurs from excessive weight bearing, sometimes mechanical trauma. So if there are stones in the walkway where cows are walking, they can get sole hemorrhages. And we really damage the underlying tissue, which is going to result in bleeding because we now have damaged that corium tissue. And so as the hooves are growing, then that blood is going to be incorporated into the hoof and that hemorrhage. So some risk factors are things like excessive standing, if they already have laminitis, if there's poor walking surfaces, so where cows are actually walking on, if the concrete's broken or there's a lot of stones in the pathways can cause this hemorrhage, and just having abnormal hooves, like if they have really thin soles or really long. So to prevent, we need to improve cow comfort. So we want to decrease standing times and increase how much cows are lying. We need to have proper heat abatement and barn ventilation. Stocking density should be less than 100%. They need proper walking surfaces. We don't want to slug feed. So what slug feeding is that where cows aren't eating and then they come up to the bunk and they eat, and they just eat this rapid, massive amount. When that happens, that's usually what causes acidosis. And so we don't want that to happen. And why they slug feed is if they don't have feed always in front of them, if feed is not getting pushed up properly, things like that. And so the only way that we can treat is through corrective. Sole ulcer is when the horn destruction punctures the claw capsule. So this is extremely, extremely painful. And you can see that on the right, that picture, the claw that's on the right, the outside claw. Can see what that actually looks like. So the support system that holds that pedal bone or that distal phalanx, so go back and look at the hoof structure. It's the very last bone in the hoof. When the support system of that pedal bone fails, the pedal bone is actually going to dislocate, and it's going to not be suspended in the hoof. It's going to fall through, and it's going to damage the corium and horn production, and that is what causes that sole ulcer. And you can see that here. See the normal looking hoof on the left, and then on the right, that pedal bone starts to sink down. It goes through the fat pad and through the corium and through the horn capsule and causes that sole ulcer. Really. So risk factors are laminitis, an abnormal claw, if there's any poor walking surfaces, or if cows are standing a lot, you can get a lot of sole ulcers. If you think about the two pens at the dairy center, and I'm standing up by toward the milking parlor end of the barn, and I'm looking down towards the lagoon, the walking surface on the right is a cobblestone, and the walking surface on the left is a grooved concrete. And we get a lot more sole ulcers and hoof lesion problems on the right side of the barn where that cobblestone is, because it really is a poor walking surface and is really hard on cows' claws, and we get quite a few sole ulcers out there because of that cobblestone. So prevention and treatment is going to be very similar to the hemorrhage. So improve cow comfort, proper heat abatement and barn ventilation, lower stocking density, make sure proper walking surfaces are available, and then decrease slug feeding and optimize nutrition. And the only way that we can treat is corrective trimming and then apply a block. So what that block does is we're going to apply the block on the opposite claw that does not have the sole ulcer, and that just gets the claw up that has the sole ulcer off of the ground, so that's not as painful and can heal more easily. Now, white line disease is the white line separation. Remember, white line is the weakest point in the claw. You can see that white line throughout the hoof here, and so it's a really weak point, and so sometimes we'll have separation with that white line. So a lot of times it's when exposure and penetration of the horn happen, and sometimes what happens after we have penetrated that horn, maybe with a stone or something like that, because we are now exposing the dermis, we could get a secondary infection, because now we've kind of opened that hoof, that sterile hoof up, and we're getting a lot of bacteria into that hoof. So we can not only have white line disease, but then can lead to an infection, which occurs often. Risk factors, we can have injury if we have laminitis, or poor walking surfaces, lots of stones, maybe where the cows are walking, they can't step around them. So prevention, when you want to optimize nutrition to make sure that that white line is not fragile, and all right, so we want to optimize nutrition to make sure that that white line is not fragile. We want to really optimize our walking surfaces, make sure that there's no stones. If there are stones in the walking lane, that's okay, as long as obviously they're not excessive, and also if we're not pushing our cows really fast. So for example, if we are bringing our cows up to the milking parlor, if we allow our cows to walk at their normal speed, they have the vision enough to be able to step around those stones. Where stones on a pathway become a problem is when we start pushing our cows up in large groups at a really, really fast manner. They cannot take the time to step around the stones. And so a lot of times it comes down to management. We're talking about white line. Cows will be able to step around the stones if we give them time and let them walk to the parlor by themselves. We can also prevent by making sure we have routine trimming, and then treatment, just like sole ulcer, is trimming a cow and then applying a block on the claw. Let's talk about infectious diseases. So foot rot, digital dermatitis, and heel. So foot rot is when the interdigital cleft is really affected. A lot of times you can notice foot rot from the painful swelling that occurs, and you really will have a foul smell. I talked about in the transition disease lecture, I talked about how much metritis smells really bad, and foot rot also smells really bad. They have, to me, very similar smells. So pathogenesis is just when the interdigital skin has trauma, and then bacteria are going to cause infection. So some pretty common bacteria are like the Diclobacter necrophorium, Fusobacterium necrophorium, and Truparella pyogenes are some really common bacteria that can cause the. So risk factors are unhygienic conditions. So if cows are in manure a lot, that can lead to tissue degradation, and then foot rot occurs. We won't have foot rot unless we have some sort of tissue degradation. And so poor walking surfaces can also lead to tissue degradation. So anytime there's stones, again, remember what I just said about white line, they can walk around stones if we allow them to. So sometimes if they get stones, step on stones, that will cause a cut in their tissue, and then bacteria can get in there. If they are housed on sand and there's not the proper type of bedding, then large grains can get in between their hooves and rub the tissue raw, and then we have tissue degradation. And then also we have another disorder called interdigital hyperplasia. That's just a corn, and so if we have corns on their hooves, then that can also rub the hoof raw, the skin raw, and then we will have bacteria enter our tissue, causing so prevention and treatment, proper walking surfaces, make sure that we have good hygiene on the farm, like cleaning out the pens a lot, and then we're using a foot bath. So I'm not going to talk a lot about foot baths here. Foot baths are, to me, foot bath is to lameness what teat dipping is to mastitis. Foot bath really prevents a lot of infectious diseases on hooves as long as it's done properly. There's a few different types of foot baths that are really common, like running copper sulfate. That's a really common one. Copper sulfate, though, has problems in the environment. It's just really heavy metal, so that can be a problem. And then I am blanking on the other, formaldehyde. It's formaldehyde. Something that's wrong with formaldehyde, though, is that it's a carcinogenic, and so it can be pretty dangerous for humans to interact with. So we need to be careful with our foot baths use, but just know that there are some pretty good recommendations when it comes to foot bathing. And then treatment is just systematic and digital dermatitis is a major problem. It is a very new disease. It was just discovered in 1974. So while that may seem like really far away for you all, it actually, in terms of disease, is really new. It was discovered in Italy in the 70s, and then from there has spread worldwide. So it's a raw inflammation of the skin above the digital cleft. You can see that on the picture on the right. You may also see hair-like projections. And digital dermatitis is also called a wart, hairy heel wart, and strawberry wart. A lot of times people just call them warts, but the real term is dermatitis. So pathogenesis is, again, we have that skin barriers weakened, so we've had some sort of tissue degradation, and then spirochetes, those are going to be of the genus Treponemas, are going to infect the dermis and cause digital dermatitis. We do not 100% know the very specific bacteria. Digital dermatitis is pretty tricky because we find a lot of bacteria, so a lot of people think it's polymicrobial, but when we look at the various samples, we always find treponemas in there. If you're curious to what those look like, go ahead and look at those spirochete bacteria. They're pretty cool looking. So some risk factors, biosecurity is huge. If you bring new animals into the herd, you are most likely going to get digital dermatitis. Doesn't always happen, that it's a pretty big risk factor. Poor hygiene, again, remember this is an infectious disease, so if we have poor hygiene, we are most likely going to have digital dermatitis. If we have poor hygiene, we're also going to have tissue degradation, and it's really common in early lactation in young cows. When we think about diseases, we usually think about them being in older cows, but digital dermatitis is funky and super fun to work with because it doesn't act like other diseases and it impacts early lactation in young cows. So prevention really is management. We really need to improve biosecurity. We need to use foot baths, and then cows that are healthy normally do a little bit better with fighting off digital dermatitis disease. And then also genetics are coming into play. This is a really heritable disease. And so there's been some work recently talking about the heritability of digital dermatitis. So genetics can also come into play. And then treatment is just topical. Basically, the way that hoof trimmers work is they're going to treat how they should. There's not great recommendations out there for hoof trimmers on how to treat different diseases, and so they're going to either straight apply copper sulfate. They might use some type of oxytetracycline. Sometimes hoof trimmers will make their own treatment. So it's just some sort of topical treatment on that digital dermatitis. Heel erosion goes along with digital dermatitis. You usually kind of see them hand in hand. And those are just grooves in the heels. And so you can see that in that picture on the right there, heel erosion, just different types of in the heels. It's when horn maceration occurs, and the groove formation can really cause a lot of pain for cattle. Risk factors, again, are poor environment. If it's really dirty, really unhygienic, then that horn maceration can occur because cows are constantly in moisture. Also, warm environments can cause more of that horn maceration than a cooler environment. So again, proper hygiene, making sure that cows are not in an unhygienic place. Foot bath use, making sure that we're constantly using proper foot baths, and then treatment is just to trim loose horn. So our take-home message for all of this to prevent lameness is that cow comfort and hygiene are of the utmost important. It really comes down to cow comfort and keeping cows clean, keeping the barn clean, and also making sure that we're using proper foot bathing procedures. I am going to post some videos from a veterinarian named Roger Bluey. He is a veterinarian in England, I think, and he has boiled some hooves in his garage, and he is going to break down the hooves for you, and it's super cool to look at. So I'm going to have you watch all those videos. All right, I'll see you next time. Thanks.